this round.
That doesn't work? Okay. Oh.
Super innovative. Cheers.
That's a huge screen.
Oh my god, really?
How did I not notice that? Let's have the round up on the backdrop. That's the battle guy again.
Alright.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Everybody good? Great. I guess I need to cough first. The United States federal judiciary should remove the United States military presence from Okinawa because it violates the National Environmental Protection Act. The advantage is NEPA. The plan applies NEPA to bases in Japan as a catalyst for broader environmental protection and stops broader military environmental destruction. Shown bomb 9. Dugong is a catalyst for protection. Promoting expansion of extraterritorial is essential. Military bases are one of the most obvious threats to the environment, and environmental policy does not hold the DoD accountable for practice on international basis. The military has no clear standards, lack punishments, and no risk of public disclosure. Irreversible environmental impacts outweigh agency action. The approach to extraterritorial protection yielded severe repercussions. Scope of NEPA is significantly larger than NHP. Any international expansion would have far-reaching consequences. The risks are being grossly ignored due to lack of U.S. mandates. This could be applied to policy justification to expand NEPA military environmental policy to provide more protection abroad. Dugong provides an opportunity to revisit the expansion of the ESA to protect endangered animals abroad. The singular case could have far-reaching impacts on the application of other environmental laws. There is now a success story to expand protection of supplemental solutions, framing international claims as a domestic issue or attempting to show adverse effects within the U.S. Initial indication of the far-reaching possibilities of protection, specifically military deference on NEPA, is a precedent for agency discretion on matters of public interest, which dilutes broader protection by heightening the burden on plaintiffs across the board. Narrative and an assessment of public interest is troublesome for future environmental litigants. The war on terror's effects on discretion make it harder to defend against executive assertion of public interest. These lead to a general dilution of environmental protection from judicial forms. The combination may make an atmosphere where litigation is an adverse legal position by default. If the effects will not be limited when the shift towards more likely standard of harm, the burden of preliminary injunction demonstrably increase. Exceptions are not confined to Japan. They come home to roost and muddle broader doctrine. Arnold and Porter intend the discretionary carpets muddle the jurisdictional landscape considerably. Not only do courts expend resources to make a determination, they reach differing conclusions as the executive presses to insulate more actions under discretion. NEPA is key to empower communities to stop environmental injustice. First, participation. It increases it in environmental decision making, which is vital to stop disparate impacts and empowers communities. Johnson 97. Minority communities are disproportionately impacted because communities do not have input in decision making. Public participation provisions like NEPA empower communities. Provisions approve decision making by enabling and solicit information vital to the process. Without such provisions, government may reach decisions that disproportionately impact minority and low income communities because the government fails to obtain input. Information enables the government to identify alternatives. NEPA provides opportunities for public participation. The agency must provide notice to the public and solicit input at minimum. The agency must invite affected federal, state, and local agencies, any affected Indian tribe proponent, other Indian interested person. The agency must respond to all comments. The EIS provides communities broad opportunities for public participation. Notification methods are much more likely to reach impacted communities. Second is a focal point. It is a point for justice struggles to coalesce around, which brings communities together to challenge environmental injustice. Johnson 97. The community may use information and political for other forms to prevent the government from going forward. If NEPA provides a focal point around which communities can organize to oppose a project, NEPA can advance environmental justice by delaying government actions. NEPA is time-consuming. Citizens can delay through litigation. Representatives can sue to force compliance. The law can provide communities with valuable time to organize and provide information. The government delay may provide communities time to explore alternative ways to prevent action. Environmental justice litigation is an effective tool for other challenges to structural oppression. Anti-prison activists have empirically been successful because of interaction with environmental injustice. There's a Braz in 60. Environmental justice movement pushed traditional notions of environmental threats further beyond toxins, threats from police and imprisonment. There is growing burdens among activists of similarities between our activism and environmental justice. Environmental justice fights discrimination, cites elective enforcement of laws and targeting communities of color, poor communities, and experts access power from and networks within. Environmental justice activists stop construction of new prison work, lead the foundation for work which would strengthen both movements. Anti-prison activists can learn from environmental justice through Delano. We filed an environmental lawsuit launch campaign against the national significance for anti-prison organizing litigation, provided a vehicle for building unique and disparate coalitions of civil rights, environmental, and anti-prison groups. Legal challenges carry the danger that organizers believe to short of the Delano campaign successfully use litigation will not relying on it. Legal action brings much needed attention to environmental justice, recognizing limits of litigation. Organizers nonetheless successfully made litigation one strategy and larger multifaceted campaign. Environmental law requires public disclosure, the opportunity to litigation provide public education organization, and the possibility offers residents to voice their concerns. These opportunities melted with the Delano campaign's central promise of the public knows the damage wrought by prisons. People will organize to stop its realization. Use of a combined drastic political and legal strategy, borrowing from and interweaving with environmental justice holds promise of moving a wide range of groups from education, awareness, environmental, and mobilization against imprisonment. The protracted battle forced the CDC to declare Delano the end of the prison building era. This was the first time in 2 decades that California did not have a business plenty of prison and plenty of construction. This movement is working to sustain this while proactively pushing for reductions in the number of Californians in cages. Anti-prison activism scholarship has deep roots in environmental justice activism. Litigation is key. It gets movement messages out and challenges state legitimacy, even if it is not a panacea. Tactically engaging is valuable, and abandonment causes market fill in Wilson. And 5, environmental justice litigation should not give up the fight of anything. Courts is not the answer. Litigation is not a lost cause. Remedies and preventive measures are more likely to move violence, assuming the role as litigators, not as background players, taking the fight of the legal arena as counterproductive. Litigating puts the community at issue as well as other communities on notice of social justice issues and needs rectifying local campaigns fail to receive attention. Legal opinions of the press with them reach a larger audience sympathetic to the movement. The more authoritative the court, the more press, the more communities benefit by learning about justice issues surrounding race, property, environment. Taking matters to court shows there are individuals willing to represent rights. Any legal victory will lend enormous credibility to the movement. Environmental plaintiffs should look to litigation as a means of obstruction. Advocates force opposition to react during a stalemate or losing. PR about litigation would act strategically utilize discourages or diversionary device while community groups attack citing decisions of the system itself from the ground up. If we let free market ideals perpetuate inequalities along race lines, government economics determine what is law, we are left with communities plagued with inequity with no recourse. In battle, one's odds of success increase proportionally with the number of fronts, allowing the communities to have a voice. Our tactics beyond the judiciary's purview. Grassroots organizations, lawyers, and strive for complementary approaches to fight environmental injustices. Environmental injustice perpetuates and amplifies broader structures of racial oppression. Community empowerment struggles are key because they remedy powerlessness, which is the root cause. Roberts and 98 community empowerment strategies must play a prominent role in the environmental justice strategy because they are the most effective means of addressing the root cause of injustice, economic and political powerlessness. Powerlessness makes poor minority communities the path of least resistance presents 2 effects: understandable land uses and one-sided enforcement of environmental losses, lives resulting in toxic hotspots. NIMBY are harmful to poor minority communities beyond pollution. NIMBY perpetuates privileges for affluent communities at the expense of poor minority communities. Community empowerment strategies are necessary because they are the only means to adequately address or remedy the underlying cause of environmental injustice. Powerlessness empowerment strategies seek to enable those who face consequences of environmental decisions to be the ones making decisions. The ultimate goal is to create numerous empowered communities who will coalesce into a movement capable of exerting pressure and affecting the agendas of key decision makers. Environment strategies are effective because their ultimate goal is to win the war against social injustice. The outcome of any particular battle is not important in terms of the final goal. Social justice empowerment strategies adopted by environmental justice stand a better chance of success than those embraced by civil rights movement. Black communities have in place institutions established during civil rights because they have experience with collective action. Communities may be more responsive to organization efforts. There are organizations such as the Congressional Black Caucus. Environmental justice advocates are better able to attract the government's attention. Specifically, extraterritorial NEPA stops global waste dumping. Helfenstein in 89, the producers or disposers can escape constraints by shipping waste to other countries. Regulation of dispersal requires extraterritorial application of U.S. law, though NEPA required agencies to consider environmental impacts of attempts to apply NEPA extraterritorially mixed results. Executive order requires complete EAIS if action involves a hazardous radioactive waste that affects the environment beyond the borders of nations participating. Although NEPA only applied to government, federal agencies supervise development projects in areas of the world where environmental regulations are less likely to be enforced. The impact is global mass death. Olson in 95, the reports of increased cancers in nuclear facilities undercut conclusions from the study of radiation. Radiation drives genetic impairments. The images a time bomb living in an environment with radioactivity in multiple sites is not reversible. The exposure translates to a fatal cancer risk of 1 in 286. Underestimation becomes a bonus. Science radiation says the death warrant. The pragmatic enforcement is complementary with radical resistance. It is necessary for interim goals, momentum building, and repurposing powerful institutions forward. And 3, transnational links are invaluable, creating understanding of global hegemony. However differently is manifested, movements are building bridges of awareness around the globe in the spirit of global collective consciousness. Movements need to adopt a symbiotic strategy, pragmatic enhancement, as well as resistance against waste. During the Basel Convention, alliances were formed between NEOs and delegates to push for a ban on waste. A ban is an important incremental step towards social change. Engaging the process as well as retaining an outside grassroots critique is an important element of reflexive movement agency. Co-option is not so clear-cut. Radicals extend critique and meaningful insiders play the game of influence while used to define the global system. They may channel support to resistance and carry ideas near the heart of power. Collective goal of global consciousness will bring insiders and outsiders together. Incipient extra-energies and radical movements are recognized and needed and dangerous. They retain the links with the grassroots and over the battle of the global system society and attempts to radicalize and expand the grassroots movement. Think globally while resisting locally. Remain in dialogue with institutionalized organizations, keeping them alert and keeping radical message ecology and social justice alive by challenging the limits of social reality in practice. Highlighting toxic waste spurs broader challenges to oppressive structures. There is no forced choice between reform and revolutionary objectives. 4 and 3 groups campaign against toxic waste do not remain in a narrow view. Campaign fosters our consciousness about toxic organizations, society, and deepening of the understanding of related issues, and more systemic based ideological shift to not in anybody's backyard. Present a concrete recognition that waste should not be produced directly. Challenging production and consumption is a wide realization of environmental justice, that movement that engages with broader questions of gender, class, racial inequality. The capitalist economy waste breaks through enclosures, politicizing issues previously considered private movements that possess emancipatory aims are bound to best recognize relationships with hegemony unless analysis articulated through globalization. Radical agency cannot still be equated with revolutionary just reformist agencies. Just a fragmentation disempowering in the face of dominant hegemonic agency. There's a spectrum of movements with an emancipatory potential. The global aspect of movements forming decentralized environmental justice movement lies in their challenge to global hegemonic structures of production and consumption. Is possible to think globally, not locally. Movements have still have to adopt a holistic approach targeting interconnected environmental and social problems of global economy. Only that linking can solve the violence of waste. Lloyd in 8 Kaisia ship with 114,000 tons incineration from Philadelphia dumped 3,000 tons of ash on a beach near Haiti. She spent 2 years trying to unload cargo on 5 different continents. The House wanted information regarding Kaisia and preserved waste work about mixed groups and resulted creation of waste management treatment specific communities provide the link between localized issues and global implications of policy solutions. That card's market policy solutions.
Good?
Mm-hmm.
All right. What is the standard that the AF sets up for an environmental activist canvas to be considered political?
I don't know.
So are you doing anything outside of this space?
Am I doing... Okay, so first, our argument is about sort of the importance of having a durable, wide-ranging collection of skills that's able to affect a wide variety of changes. So, like, it's not so much that you necessarily have to go bother NEPA after this. The second thing is that, yeah, I guess that's the answer to this. And the second thing is that the 1AC itself is an expression of challenging the not in my backyard logics that enable, for instance, waste dumping to occur to people that aren't like us.
Alright, what nuclear waste does the act resolve?
Does the act resolve? Well, it sort of talks about waste dumping broadly.
What nuclear waste is the United States military dumping abroad in the basis where NEPA would apply after that?
Two things. First is that the plan is broader than just allowing NEPA abroad. It stops the sort of loopholes that occur domestically. Second is that the Helfenstein card is talking about disposal extraterritorially, so it doesn't talk about...
Let me get this right. Your extinction warrant is all about...
There's no extinction impact.
I'm sorry, your world-ending warrant...
There's no world-ending warrant. The Olson
mass
card
death, whatever.
Yeah.
That's about nuclear waste, correct?
Yes.
Is that what is being dumped in Okinawa?
Do you think that I can clarify real quick,
Yeah, go
maybe?
for it, Michael.
This internal link is not based upon the military, but rather using the military as a stepping stone towards broader extraterritorial application creates a check upon corporations who dump nuclear as well as non-nuclear waste abroad. One example that our evidence cited was how people would incinerate papers and there would be a bunch of ash and they dump it right off the coast of countries in the Caribbean, which literally means that communities who depend upon fish for their livelihood can no longer survive.
I'm confused. So, like, where does the United States military and our presence in Okinawa come into this? Like,
the Schoenbaum evidence.
So our Schoenbaum evidence is about the use of NEPA extraterritorially as a precedent. Our evidence says that
so the act doesn't rewrite anything about NEPA itself, right?
Untrue. It closes the extraterritorial loophole. It means that NEPA
That's not in your plan text, is it?
Right, but that's an effect of the plan as per the Schoenbaum.
So you're claiming that you extratopically change a law?
No, an effect of the plan is that it creates a precedent, like any precedent F in the entire history of debate, that then changes the way that NEPA is applied.
You use a lot of terms in your evidence, like mobilization, momentum, building bridges. How do we know the F spurs any of that?
I guess there's like, obviously we can't know for certain, but our evidence says that it's a narrow interpretation of NEPA that prevents communities from being able to effectively utilize it. But then
who gets to determine what is environmentally just?
Communities determine what is environmentally just.
Are you in the community in Okinawa?
No, obviously not.
When it's sent, will be one-off case.
Is any of it going to be on paper?
Not now.
Okay.
Could you pass me my water bottle? It's on the floor next to my chair.
Indubitably.
This is something.
Yeah, toss me that one, Ben, please. That's mine.
Yeah. I was gonna bring it if no one said. You probably needed more than I do.
Alright, do you all have it?
No, sorry.
Okay. No problem.
Have you been washing your hands?
What?
Have you been washing your hands, or do I need to go wash my hands after touching your water bottle?
I washed my hands, Rob.
Okay. I'm not getting
They're
that.
not Jacob.
I'm not getting that Jacob illness, man.
No, shrink this. The importance of washing your hands.
Okay.
I'll put up a banner.
I think we're good when y'all are.
Cool. Sorry.
The law is an empty canal. The aft labors alongside as the waters of revelation still flow through its channels. The 1AC is the nothing of revelation, an invocation of sovereign law that can only ever be an empty gesture. Reject the 1AC's politics of abandonment. White 9. The law is an empty canal which in the past generation under different conditions has been filled with the living water of faith and its clear perception of the dry canal form the rushing water revelation is no longer nourished wall. The men who have the law inhabit this empty canal, attending its banks, the living water fashions its own course, leaving them behind in this dusty riverbed. The law and religion are an impress of revelation. Can the possibility of the water has been cut out, we rule out the form of holiness, the holy only in form, no attempt to spiritualize it can protect such holiness from the increasing vacuity of the law that remains in force after the messianic event is an empty law devoid of life and conscience. content, such vacuity and emptiness characterize the law in the state of exception that become the norm of lost for its transcendent authority with no substantial claim to legitimacy understood as the nothing of revelation, a state in which revelation appears to be nothing without meaning and in which it still asserts itself as being enforced without significance. Precisely the structure of the empty law that subsists in abandonment. To be abandoned is exposed to simply a compulsion to appear before the law. Such abandonment is not a state without the law, but the other side of the law which constitutes the law. More frightening than the law that is applied is the law that exists only in potentiality and through its own suspension captures all of its life and its band. All societies have entered into the legitimization crisis which law supports the pure nothing revelation. The app can produce new knowledge, only recirculate the old. Vote negative on presumption. There's no value to the one he sees inquiry. Grant 5. Heraclitus sees human beings as lacking understanding of this world being, if forever do men prove to be uncomprehending both before they hear and once before they've heard it. If we do not know the right language, we cannot interpret the information the senses provide. The Lord, whose oracle is at Delphi, neither reveals nor conceals but gives a sign. Heraclitus does not reveal or conceal but produces complex including messages for those who can interpret them. He uses puns, paradoxes, and literary devices to construct expressions that have meanings beyond the obvious. He sees his own expressions as imitations of the world with its structural and semantic complexity. To learn to solve these puzzles is to learn to read the signs of the world. Heraclitus stresses the inductive effort rather than deductive method of grasping the world, listening not to me but to the world is still wise to agree that all things are one. The academy is the new factory. The app positions a plan of relation of knowledge as a tool of transaction that reduces education to commodity status, energizing the rat race. The pedagogy is the ultimate form of microfascism. Prefer impotence. Lewis 11. The learner is the one who is not yet complete, perpetually not yet knowledgeable, skillful, autonomous. So of this course, the learning emphasizes education as an economic transaction. The learner is the potential consumer, the educator, institution, the provider. Education itself becomes a commodity, a thing to be consumed by the learner. Within capitalist production, political life is overcome by the eternal return of laboring life. The discourse of the learning society is at the same time an effect of the instrument of the vectory of animal borons. Learning becoming an organizing principle for optimizing labor productivity, and the citizen becomes first and foremost the learner without a flexible knowledge economy that demands constant retraining or reskilling. In the learning society, we live in a situation of permanent threat as university teacher, citizen, and so on. Within the learning society, the learner must become an energetic, working, autonomous individual. The learner is not simply not yet consumer, but is more importantly capacity for labor. Education is a type of social orthopedics that seeks to punish and instead focuses on correcting potentialities rather than being dependent on the teacher. Potentialities with the learning society are connected to self-managing behaviors and governmentality. The self-educational investments transform us into entrepreneurial individuals who organize our own potentials for maximum outputs. The battery task the individual undergoes help to identify, classify, train, and actualize their unrealized potential as students, workers, and citizens. When it states in neoliberal democracy, the question of potentiality in relation to actuality. Neoliberalism views the child as an infinite potentiality that can and must be actualized through constant performance testing. With this current environment, reflections about work, organization, and education run the risk of becoming senseless and irrelevant. I propose we turn to Agamben's theory of study. Study enables us to retain our potential, our very potentiality, not to be in the fact our greatest form of freedom. The last end of study is to become nothing at all, but rather remain with an impure capacity to be or not to be. Vote negative. Their pedagogical acceleration ensures debates are mere regurgitations of information of the form, a process, and message is perfected through improved speech. The information contained in the voice becomes meaningless. The impact is debate implodes under its own hyperdensity. Baudrillard 92. Occupied with the acceleration of all bodies, all messages, all processes, each event, each narrative, each image gets endowed with the simulation of infinite trajectory. Every political fact is invested with kinetic energy which spreads over its own space and thus thrusts into a side hyperspace where they all lose meaning by way of an inability to attain their meaning. The narrative has become impossible. This potential re-narrativization, each event becomes atomized as it falls into the wind in order to diffuse itself ad infinitum. It has to be fragmented like a particle. No meaning stands a chance once offered its own means of acceleration. Our society is governed by a critical mass going beyond a point of no return. The inner matter of the social is not due to a lack of exchanges. Information or communication is the result of a multiplication, the saturation of exchanges, the hyper density of messages is meant to attain their annihilation and indifference, neutralizing bullets sprayed by information. The masses neutralize history, retrospect, and act as a screen of absorption. No meaning, no conscience, no desire. They are potential residues of all history, of all meaning, all social, historical, and temporal transcendence. Absorb via the masses, silent emptiness. We have gone beyond this limit or boundary where subjected to factual and informational sophistication. History itself ceases to exist in interference of an event with its diffusion. Short circuit cause and effect is of a certain point. Nothing is true anymore. This is why the soft music of history escapes us. It disappears into the stereophony of information. Case. Their understanding of the environment obscures the realities of environmental degradation. You should refuse that calculus. Theme 8. Nature is violent. These violent parts concern when it comes to morality. Aristotle's notion believes it can fundamentally exclude the perverse elements from the field of morality. These excluded elements constitute a class of desires put into relation with the contemporary destruction of life and earthly environment. Particular ethics must be inserted. The better part of the microcosm brought together in a sovereign good. When it comes to the aspects that we conceptualize nature, Nietzsche would encourage creative self-elimination rather than repression and phobic denial. We find the temptation to interpret reality with our pleasure principle to deselect parts we do not like. Reality is not truth but means avail over. What desire builds the dams, flares, return of the thing. The move we move that makes goes beyond the pleasure principle is the death drive with our advancements in technological power matching the awareness gained as a whole of the prehistoric thing with the great 21st century ecological death that seems more than just a little possible willful ignorance of the thing now bears results so far terrifying and possibly to rationally accept. Today, when faced with problem, we think the answer is to be more moral, more good, and to continue to predicate themselves on a radically false picture of the human condition. We are accelerating along the path of massive destruction because we aren't in accordance with no moral ideal of the sovereign good, but rather it's because we aren't in accordance enough with a proper understanding of the real. It's because we still at some level think that being more moral in accordance with good is the answer to problems. The asked call for environmental justice obfuscates the problematic methodological frame and risks redefining systems of thoughts that make unfair environmental distribution thinkable because of its investments in rights theories. Part 10. Environmental questions are contradictory. The majority of eco-critical arguments are drawn primarily on models of thinking taken from oppositional politics in the modern tradition. This general stance has been accompanied with an increased attention to the questions of environmental justice. The environmental justice movement evokes the visions of a just society. Climate change may mark the closure of exhaustion of modes of environmental politics embedded in a modernist liberal tradition. The blockage may be perhaps positive such a simplistic theoretical goal in the first place. Climate change does not present any one easily identifiable antagonist causes diffuse, unpredictable, separated from their effects by huge gaps in space and time. Another danger is that the tendency to voice environmental justice, equitable inclusion, legitimizes the center from which people claim to be excluded. Eco-criticism thus becomes covert legitimization of consumer democracy. The ass deliberative democracy can never challenge injustice. We must instead embrace the ethos of an activist, a simple refusal to engage in any system founded on structural inequality. Young and one. The deliberative Democrat advocates processes and actions implementing the existing democracy with all its inequality. The deliberative Democrat thinks the best way to promote greater social justice fosters the creation of sites and processes of deliberation. The activist is committed to social justice and non-native value in the idea that politically responsible persons ought to take a position, positive action, promote these normal workings of social and economic political institutions that act or reproduce deep wrongs. Laws and policies have unjust effects of social and economic structures, cause injustice since the rules and practices of these institutions perpetuate these wrongs. We cannot redress them within those rules. Activists opposes particular actions or policies of public institutions as well as systems of policy. Since many are ignorant of these institutional harms, activists believe it is important to express outrage and continued injustice, motivate others to act. The activist excuse deliberation with persons wielding political or economic power and official representatives of the institution believes perpetuating injustice or harm. The activist takes other action more effective in conveying criticism forms of direct action. And this is specifically true in the context of environmental justice. Young and one. When social, economic, and political institutions produce unjust structural inequalities and other serious social and environmental harms, insist the activist is more important for citizens to try to avoid complicity with the workings of those institutions. Activities and protests and disruption are most appropriate for getting citizens to think seriously about what until then they may have found normal and acceptable activities of deliberation tend to be more confer legitimacy on existing institutions, effectively silence real dissent. And the ass turns nature into an interactive subject through its liberation of as energy. Nature is not just the good in the form of energy, but also the evil of scorpions and pathogens. Bojo 94. Idealization always goes with abjection. This is a kind of symbolic rule. A new wave of human beings is voices coming by new human rights offenses following the same logic to core with nature. The status of a subject amounts to a definitive recognition of nature's voice. When nature is recognized as a subject, we've objectified it to death. All that has been brought about by this way in the concept of nature as well. The modern discovery of nature consists of the liberation of a mechanical transformation of the world. Nature is becoming an interactive subject, ceasing to be an object, a paradox, which also affects human beings. We are much more compromised when we cease to exist and be objects and become subjects. This is truth pulled on us the name of liberation. Let's not pull the same one on nature, for the ultimate danger is that they're only subject. All our problems today originate here, not in an excess of alienation, but a disappearance of alienation in favor of maximum transparency between subjects and focusing on nature, the status of subject. We are foisting on it all the vices of subjectivity, a bad conscience, range drives, an impulse for revenge. The balance we see we hear of inequality is not so much that of resources and their exploitation.
Stopping at exploitation.
Yeah, I'm putting the mark there.
Alright, you good?
Yep.
What does the alt do about endless circulating knowledge production?
There is no hope.
Yep.
Okay, so what do you do to stop the endless circulating knowledge production? Why is the app a uniquely bad form of this?
We say that the app is the app doesn't have to be a uniquely bad form of it. If we win that argument, we think Ben should vote negative.
Why, given the massive other contributors to this?
That just because saying it's not just me is not sufficient for the problem. That's exactly
Okay.
sort of that
But
plays
if
into the logic.
it's beneficial, but then contributes to a bad that is already occurring massively.
I missed the first part of that question.
If the app has like some benefit, but then also causes something negative that's already happening, that will happen with or without it, why is that a reason to vote negative?
Are you saying
that question is so vague, I'm not sure how to answer it. Could you
fine.
make that more specific?
If we're not supposed to use debate to educate us about problems and teach us strategies, what should we use debate to be doing?
Study. So
Study what?
that Agamben identifies studies, the Lewis evidence in particular discusses Agamben's notion of study as the possibility of remaining open to potentialities of things. It's the
Okay, so
embrace.
we stay super open to every potentiality. What then do we do after debate? How does that guide us in like what we end
We think
up?
it provides a better understanding of things.
So we like
It's a better way to come to understand the way we understand
We understand
knowledge,
stuff?
problems in the world, that
So
sort
what
of
happens
thing.
once we understand problems? What does it teach us to then do about them?
We don't know.
Okay, cool.
That's the point. We need to keep the
That's
possibilities
cool.
open.
What reality? So the first Themi-link says that we obscure realities of environmental degradation. What is a reality of environmental degradation that we obscure?
The argument in the Themi evidence is that nature is not just some benign object that has a natural harmony to it. It is something that is necessarily violent. What he sees in
what is saying that there shouldn't be waste dumping on poor communities or communities full of people of color due to deny that nature has reality and is violent?
It disavows sort of the violent parts of nature. Also, it assumes that pursuit of policy and action in names of the sovereign good.
You can't bring an environmental suit against nature. You can bring an environmental suit against a corporation or the government for dumping on you. So I fail to see how the app has anything to do with our notions of nature, natural disasters. It seems like they come against
notions of how we should relate to the environment all premised upon the sort of conception of that we need to be more moral, more good, that the Themi evidence is criticizing.
Where does the Themi evidence say that we should allow waste dumping, other forms of violence against?
It does not say allow waste dumping. It says we should resituate our ethical calculus away from the good.
Away from the good towards what?
The bad.
The bad. So we should let bad stuff happen.
No.
Oh, okay.
That's a misreading of the evidence.
We'll take a second part maybe?
I was listening to that. I had mostly chosen them. Is there anything you want to talk about? to change the world to embrace can kill you too, so you experiment now. The Clark Ave is about climate change, doesn't assume the tie of environmental justice objectives. A nexus for organizing, even if review does not directly change policy. It is a vehicle for communities of color to coalesce and organize demands for justice. That's Johnson. This makes the environment a stepping stone towards broader now and works upon people, so it is only a question of whether we can deploy it towards good. Now, even if it's not transformative, they've conceded that there are huge material benefits of short-term concerns like waste that the law can rectify. That's the Ford evidence calling capacity for collective decisions, local for melter here, psychologically, ideologically, materially for the revolution, need for transitional demands, alliances, revolutionary reforms, needs a policy agenda that makes stronger gains within capitalism, which permits further movement against capitalism. The last Baudrillard card says nothing. I saw you roll their eyes when they read this, because it doesn't make an argument. We don't make nature a subject any more than the status quo does now. The K. Or framework, whatever it is. Debate should prioritize evaluation of policy options. The window is open for policy scholarship to have a tangible effect. Focusing research on policy allows for debaters to be a training ground to produce effective scholar activists. Islami and Napoli 10. Research is an increasingly important tool for those at the community, state, federal, and international levels to overcome obstacles impeding democratic public research, strengthen and inform public advocacy analysis, and that's a tremendous amount to offer contribute solutions to social and policy problems to participate on equal footing in policy advocacy. Public advocacy work needs to be increasingly research-driven. This suggests steady blurring of the distinction between scholar and the activist advocate. Visibility can be improved by a stronger public engagement that is about greater scholar activist advocate integration and greater visibility. Policy windows are open. This provides a tremendous opportunity to write innovative research, defensible answers, and proposals that affect the evolution of our public spheres. There is no better, more important time for research to be put into action, and debate creates activists capable of engaging policy forces. An in-depth comparison of costs, jurisdiction, implementation, etc. Is best to create activists who can influence policy. These collaborations are empirically necessary to stop waste builds epistemic communities who can influence global waste policy from the bottom up. That is the Lloyd evidence. Prefer the empirics of this card and how transnational movements were able to make change at the international level through those forums because of policy skills. More broadly, our framework is key to environmental justice. Below Juve. Environmental justice groups are making voices heard loud and clear. Groups are winning in courts, making a difference. And lives people from West Harlem to LA and Houston to Chicago. Groups won important victories. They defeated the landfill for Rosebud Reservation and South Dakota. The driving force was relentless pressure and laser-like focus of residents working together. Environmental justice leaders, activists, and academicians, assisted public officials. They worked with decision makers to correct the imbalances. Now, the Baudrillard case provides no prospect for political organizing and just gives at least a free pass to be racist and violent. McLaren and Leonardo 8. Or 98. Baudrillard church critique toward a dissing perspective. We could not help but feeling and be free to Baudrillard's idealism led to a sign fetishism. He uncritically underplays the role of manipulation by media. Baudrillard monologue, the power to deconstruct political interests. Their source of Baudrillard blames control of social processing in the hands of a mystified and disembodied non-entity by leaving out actors and architects of policy that control political discourse. Baudrillard cannot hold political groups accountable and defer their action. Meanwhile, Reagan, Wilson, and Gingrich have a field day, although mass silence may be bred as vengeance, general alienation of massive people from the political process. The interest of the few neglect has real consequences. Baudrillard provides no useful model for collective agency or solidarity. Baudrillard articulates no hope for political process. What we can look forward to is the perpetual spiral of simulation. Meanwhile, suffering and pain continue, and politics is possible. Intersubjectivity and communication can still found the groundwork of politics. Reject overgeneralization towards and a Baudrillard portrayal is too stark. That said, a station while reality downplays the possibility for human communication, intersubjectivity, and collective action. If intersubjective communication is impossible, why we write journal articles for intellectual communities? Ideology as a form of community coherence is not within way, nor has the power of legal system. The social world is not as fragmented as academicians, the academic communities implicitly affirm. The pragmatic conceptions of meaning, maybe more so than they do fragmentation now, filter all their politics fails arguments through the lens that if there is any chance politics or meaning is possible, you should vote affirmative, because they leave communities of color who are dying in the status quo from pollution, no prospects for getting out the dismal hellhole that white society has put them into. If they're right about their analysis, it is just an interesting FYI, but failure to engage with institutions means it's useless, no advice or none. Privilege and language result in losing sight of political relation. Discourse can alone account for enduring structures. Discourse analysis redistributed to localized power constrained constituted through situational specific notion in order to underestimate structural reality of permanent hierarchical power relation finds it difficult to deal with institutional stability. Institutional stability include power of the state, colonialism. These make social practice such as discursive formation what they are. Mark the card. The word are and the alternative. Their argument is not mutually exclusive with the affirmative. We can engage in a process of study while still recognizing the necessity of making contingent demands. The alternative rejects the possibility of all meaning or all actions, then it makes it impossible to have need for review, because that requires that you document a problem, that you identify its effects, and have a community process, or else it's impossible to challenge structures. Now, they don't solve the university link. You literally describe the alternative study, which is the epitome of the ivory towerism your evidence criticizes. Second is you can think that the university is that and still vote affirmative. We are a process of taking the skills away from it as a means of influencing and changing society. Refuse their fatalism. Pedagogy is our only hope for the future. We must tie it to demands 013. Power is never so overwhelming, there's no room for resistance. We need to impose a certain kind of responsibility upon schools. It is not to say they operate under terrible burdens. They not only have to particular kinds of pedagogies in their classrooms, but they also have to join social movements that give the collective input that can bear down on those problems and create change. The left is never taken seriously because it really doesn't understand that at the center of politics is a question of pedagogy. Pedagogy is marginal, but it's not something that can be reduced to a method. You can't turn these established institutions over to the right. You can't simply dismiss them by saying they're nothing more than hegemonic institutions that oppress people. They're a retreat from politics. You have to fight within these. Critique can never become so overwhelmingly that we all become our critics and nothing else. We need the language possibility to be able to go forward, and their race neutrality means the alternative replicates whiteness, roll-ups, six races of blind spot and philosophical aesthetics. Aestheticians bypass such a technical to insulate their premises inquiries from the relations of racial transformation, discipline, shuns exposing structural principles to the workings of racial difference. Color blindness not only fails to contest racial domination, but assists in maintenance. That card stopped at maintenance.
Sort of the process of how communities of color can take advantage
Sure.
of NEPA. So you get rid of some loopholes in the law, so then they are free to bring litigation before courts that could allow pollution to be rescinded, right?
Or a couple of things. I think that's a simplification. It's not that the act just removes some loopholes. Rather, it is the act closes the public interest exception. The justification used for presence in Okinawa to avoid NEPA review is that the executive or any federal agency can say that because there is, quote, a compelling national interest, they can shut down challenges that are occurring. So communities of color are galvanizing around NEPA right now, but the executive, state, local, federal agencies now have a blank check to ignore their demands
so the
and
act
simply
enables
ignore
communities
NEPA.
of color to better bring litigation to challenge
It
environmental
stops
degradation
current
in their
and
neighborhoods.
ongoing challenges from being circumvented, and it re-energizes the broader NEPA canon, because the perception that can be applied to something as seemingly sacrosanct as a military base is viewed as a symbolic commitment to expansion of NEPA in other fields. That's the Schoenbaum evidence.
Okay, I've got a question about the Newman evidence. It says, it's talking about making demands on the state. How is the AF an example of that?
We demand that the state should remove its military presence from Okinawa because it violates NEPA.
But
And
this
sort of,
evidence,
sorry,
he's
really
talking
quick,
in the
more
context
broadly,
of
every NEPA review is a demand on the state.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Okay,
so we access even a bigger
what is the
financial
revolution that the affirmative enables?
What is the what?
The revolution the affirmative enables. Your Ray evidence discusses.
Our Ray evidence says that the fatalism of your law, K, subverts revolutionary politics.
What sort
because
of revolution? Revolution against what?
Against structures of domination. In the 1AC, we identified white supremacy, environmental injustice, classism, capitalism, etc.
Okay.
Our Ray evidence says that rejection of interim gains means that communities who are already vulnerable can never mobilize because their interests are not being met.
So your argument, make sure I'm getting this clear, is that your pedagogy trains us to be better, more productive activists, right?
That's a really terrible way of
I mean, I got like 10
failing.
seconds. So
we think we can make activists who are able to change the world We need to use debate as a site of honing those skills. We obviously are not tied to the broader productivity K you're going to read in the 1AR. 1NR.
Brett.
You wanna take some property?
Mhm.
No, thank you.
Thank you. got a hard keyboard?
I got the force keyboard.
Oh, okay. Alright, I'm starting at the top of my framework position.
Should I just go everything straight down?
That's what I felt like you were gonna do already.
Well, I definitely am now.
Yeah, I thought that's what all judges are doing these days.
Well, I like to think that I can line it up, but if I don't need to, just let me know.
I mean,
Something like acid mates, when you start to give an order, they're just like, I'm
yeah.
just going straight down.
Like Eisenstadt, just like, no, just stop talking.
Fair.
Alrighty. Anyone not ready? The law is an empty canal. That does not mean that the structure does not exist, but that the workings of the structure itself are not apparent in the way that the 1AC claims that they're apparent. The workings of the canal are not such because it's fucking dry. Now, this first piece of evidence is that policy comes first because we need to have a training ground to become scholar activists. There's a couple problems inherent in this piece of evidence. First is that it keeps referring to a so-called policy window. This policy window is another word for the empty canal of politics. It is a window with a pane that does not allow you to get through it. It allows you to see through to the other side. This is what Kafka says in his story Before the Law, of whereby the law is a never-ending process of doors, whereby the gatekeepers simply say, you can look kind of through this door, but you can't go beyond it. This is the saying that once we just cross the threshold of being political, or once we cross the threshold of being scholar activists, something will change. That threshold is only there in order to make us think that chasing our tails in the legalistic debate is necessarily good. The second problem with this piece of Asalama 10 evidence is the notion of the, quote, scholar activist. This is a fake identity category that spiritualizes the 1AC's bad faith in the law. My White and 09 evidence says that this turns their impact to the framework claim, which is about developing good research, because it says that instead of actually developing research about the world, our research becomes predicated and self-referential to the idea of who we are. Or in other words, we create an identity category known as the scholar activist and then write to legitimize that identity category. That is a self-referential form of knowledge that only creates cyclical forms of training, which does not actually help anyone outside of our own space. This forms of solipsism should be rejected. This form of solipsism should be rejected because knowledge is a trump impact. When study is a burden, it can only ever be an irritant to the student. A hurdle to overcome so that one's education can become useful. When confronted with the 1AC, you should prefer not to leave the labyrinth of the law and instead play in its shadows. Lewis 11. Studying is interminable. Long hours spent roaming around among books. Every fragment of coward seems to be open a new path. The labyrinth elusiveness is that it not only can study can have no rightful end, but also does not have to desire one. With each new book discovered, each new reference, the trail of clues becomes more elusive and at the end more distant from the student. Studying and stupefying are in the sense akin. The scholar mismatched across the forehead by the enigma is no longer convinced that he or she knows what he or she is supposed to know. Compulsively pursued by her stupefaction, we stumble along, dwelling in the scholarly potential that is not concerned with any particular educational standard outcome. To study is to undergo a certain inoperativity where we expose all our thoughts and possibilities and yet are undestined to do any one or any set of them. If we simply remain mired in the ontology of generic potentiality and its relationship to learning, studying remains a burden. The goal of education becomes to overcome this latency period as quickly as possible. There is a rush to close the gap between education and political practice. Studying is an obstacle, an irritant, an irrefuting reality whose only utility is an instrumental value for reaching another end. The time of study is messianic time, both no longer and not yet. Simultaneously, it is a paradoxical time that by embodying both logic suspends them and renders them inoperative. It is a zone of indistinction. The messianic is not simply waiting for the Messiah to come. It is rather a temporality that within learning exceeds the measure of learning. The time that opens up in the gap between chronology and the end of time is a kairos, an incoherent time whose truth is in the moment of abrupt interruption, as if is the logic of learning, where we are learning as if we are working or learning as if we are democratic citizens. It is this logic through which all activities are subsumed under the expanding instrumentalities of learning. Expanding instrumentalities of learning. Now, the next argument. Now you can encapsulate this argument that the law and engagement with the law is necessarily paradoxical with two routes to voting negative. The first is the paradox argument, which is that you should just presume negative because of the paradox of inquiry. In other words, what is the 1AC searching for? How will they know when they have found it? Either way, that they cannot isolate what it means to be a scholar activist, or how we can know we have become a scholar activist when we get there, which means I can't negate something that they haven't defined, which means you should presume that you should presume negative until they have defined what it means that they are actually trying to become. The second route to voting negative is the preferring not to argument, or in other words, that you should just prefer not to engage in the 1AC's bad faith. I don't have to win some kind of alternative production, but in other words, if I just win a link to their understanding of sovereignty is a form of bad faith and that it reinforces our engagement with the law, then that form of bad faith you should just prefer not to engage in that. It's that simple. Also, it doesn't have to be coherent. That's the entire point of study, that studying leads us down different paths of paradoxes and discoherencies that I cannot just like reformulate into some coherent narrative. Rather, I'm going to trace the lines of fracture within the 1AC's logics. Now, the next argument is 2AC2 epistemic communities solves for policy skills and enables enviro-justice, Boulard 2K. First, three arguments here. First is that this evidence is not about Okinawa, which means it's not often to their ass. Second is that the military is not beholden to overseas domestic groups, which takes out the internal link to this logic, which says that people in Los Angeles were able to fight against air pollution standards. That is not the same thing when people are resisting the United States military presence in places like Okinawa, where they have been resisting it for decades, verbally and discursively, to Abe. I don't know how you pronounce the Prime Minister of Japan's last name, but he has heard this criticism and has done nothing as a result of it. The third argument on the Boulard 2K evidence is that what even is justice? What is environmental justice? Until you define what environmental justice is, you do not get to access offense claiming that you enable environmental justice, because you haven't even defined the skill that you're claiming to give us. The next argument is that Baudrillard is not organizational and therefore is racist. McLaren 98, one, not my Baudrillard. You answered this K as if it was some kind of Baudrillard position. This evidence keeps saying Baudrillard's model, Baudrillard's model. What is Baudrillard's model? I read one piece of Baudrillard evidence on this flow that you blew off anyway, and it's my argument isn't a retreat to linguistics. That's the logic within this McLaren 98 evidence, that retreats to linguistics are necessarily bad. Their engagement with the law is a retreat to linguistics because they just point towards legalistic structures or laws that are, quote, on the books, and say us presencing those laws on the books necessarily changes things. That is a linguistic focus for your politics, which is bad. Now group those answers with the Schwartz 8 evidence that they say politics is possible because of intersubjectivity. This evidence disproves itself. He has a rhetorical question in the middle that says, why do you write journal articles? It's like he has created the identity category of the scholar. Schwartz has created the identity category of the scholar activist, and then it questions people who question his logics by saying, well, why have I been writing these journal articles all along? That is the self-referential nature of their arguments. It's saying, well, look what I'm doing. How could that be bad? Next argument, they say any risk. This is where I have to stake the debate. They're going to go for this. Any risk that the affirmative creates some form of good pedagogy is a reason to vote for them, and that the negative is a functionally defensive argument, and that if institutionalism is good, then you would vote affirmative. But one, this doesn't come to terms with the language turn that I made above, which in other words, their understanding of institutional engagement is a necessarily superficial linguistic act which turns their logic of any risk changing the world is good. Second is that the affirmative, the second is that this evidence says, quote, structures are independent from the world at large. That's the argument that I have to win in order for you to vote negative, that the law as a structure is necessarily independent of our ability to linguistically alter it. That is why the law is an empty canal. If it was full, then our language would change it in this space. The next argument is permutation not mutually exclusive. There's no alternative on this page. I explained above that this is a question of the link. It's also a question of the paradox of inquiry, which means I don't have to win some kind of alternative. You invented that. I don't have to make a permutation. Also, our knowledge is necessarily mutually exclusive because you shouldn't be able to sever out of the bad faith inherent in the 1AC, which you did not question the logics of whether or not your understanding of the law is necessarily a form of bad faith. Instead, you just assume this was Baudrillard and answered it like that. Don't let the 1AR come back with new responses to Agamben because it predicates our block strategy. They say that we take skills from the university. My argument isn't university bad, but laboring within the university as if it had a one-to-one connection with the law is necessarily bad. The affirmative model of political subjectivity guarantees unending global violence in the name of the sovereign. In preferring not to do the work of the law, we also prefer not to be dominated. Only this reclamation of the law from sovereignty via refusal can challenge the paradigm of biopolitics. That was our Lewis evidence from the 1C. The next argument is this refuse fatalism, Giroux evidence. We say that legal fatalism is necessary, but that the negative is not an existential fatalism. If we win our links, then it means they have an existential fatalism inherent in their argument, which is that we have to be able to float down the law, the canal of the law, which is empty, which means our boat isn't going anywhere, which means that the endpoint of the 1AC is fatalistic if we win our arguments about the 1AC not engaging in the law. The last argument is this race neutrality disadvantage. I don't think there's a link to the alternative, or there's not a link to my arguments on this race neutrality disadvantage. I don't have to endorse Baudrillard's theory in the abstract, so there's no link to this position.
Cross-eyes?
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear waste is being dumped upon indigenous lands. Factories that emit a bunch of toxic fumes are being targeted and put into predominantly black neighborhoods. What does your endless process of studying do for those people
Nothing.
who are affected?
Nothing.
So why should we endorse it?
Because one, it's not lying to itself about its own capabilities. Two, it doesn't take the law in terms of bad faith.
Okay, so it's not lying to itself, it's an honest reaction. Why the hell do those communities who are being bombarded with environmental waste care whether you have an honest relationship or not?
If you want to be specific to a certain community, I can talk about that, but my first answer is going to be, I don't think there's anyone in this space who can hear my words that you're referring to. Second of all, I think that a more fundamental question is, what is our relationship to the law, rather than how can we change this one specific implementation of a law
Okay,
and
so
how that
where
will
do we
benefit
go
someone else.
once we have found out what our relationship to the law is?
That's
How do we
something
get
that
out of the
that's
endless
what we're saying,
paradox?
is that's really never like a found out thing. It's kind of like, if we think it's an easy,
So the alternative forecloses the
if we
possibility
think
of
our
action.
relationship to the law is easy, we're probably wrong.
So does that mean the alternative forecloses the possibility of action, legal or otherwise, to resolve broader structures?
We're saying in this instance, the action you've called for is bad. So I'm not going to speak to like the infinite foreclosure in the future.
Okay,
This is
the
about this debate.
You're saying the app is bad. Both teams agree the status quo is also bad. So I'm wondering, what is the uniqueness for your argument?
Can you explain what uniqueness is?
How
Like,
do you
resolve
any of the problems of the status quo, I guess?
I mean, like in the actual sense of the Lewis evidence, I don't have to have a uniqueness claim in order to prefer not to engage the law the way the 1AC chose to engage the law. Preferring not to is itself like a studious way of interacting with your scholarship.
Alright, the Lewis evidence near the bottom, right before you marked it, criticizes the as-if logic. How is that criticism of rejecting as-if logic commensurable with its endorsement of broad practices of studying, learning about things that are external to ourselves? How is that not another form of as-if logic?
Are you saying, how am I not a link to as-if, or how are you a link
This
to
evidence
as-if?
calls for endless studying, and then it also says as-if logic, theorizing about things we don't have control over is bad. Why doesn't studying also trigger
This is
that?
saying like the as-if logic, like as if we were scholar activists, right? Like you create an identity category and then post hoc justify your work based off of that identity category. I'm saying that those categories shouldn't be determining what the scholarship
What sort
is
of
in the
things
first
should
place.
we study?
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that pretty much covers it. I have like 7 seconds left.
Okay. Document should be sent out. Everybody got it? Ben, you good?
The order is the case.
Yeah, sorry.
Give me 1 second, Danny.
Go.
Yeah.
The app does not resolve most of their claims about the way that communities of color are bombarded with nuclear waste in the status quo. Even if you grant them 100% solvency, that means they open an avenue for communities of color to pursue litigation in civil courts that allow for the potential removal of nuclear waste. This ignores structural inequalities that exist in the legal system. This is the thesis of our Young evidence, the stance of the deliberative Democrat, which is the stance that the affirmative takes, that we can have singular policies that promote better social justice without addressing larger institutional structures is something that trades off, that naturalizes those structures. This is a whitewashing DA that I don't think was properly dressed in the 2AC. We have an alternative argument here, is that we should adopt the ethos of the activists, which is those who operate completely outside these structures of the state. Protest against the state is specifically better in the context of raising consciousness and creating environmental change. So that's the one and C Young evidence from the one and C Young evidence. Then cross-examination, Michael talks about the way that factories are built in communities of color in Indian land is colonized and exploited for its resources. The AF's removal of presence in Okinawa does not change those things. There are larger structures of anti-blackness and colonialism that make that code those realities that the AF cannot possibly resolve. They read this piece of May evidence. First off, I'm not going for the Femi argument, but this May evidence is not a response to our Baudrillard claims. Yes, action can be life-affirming in the abstract. Our argument is not that it is never life-affirming, but merely that the AF's action is something that is not your conception of the way that nature operates as some harmonious machine, that the only problem is when humans introduce nuclear waste into is a bad conception of nature, because it underlies the fact that nature is fundamentally constituted by fundamentally violent processes. That's the one and C Baudrillard evidence. Your attempt to fix nature is something that subjectifies it, that subjects it to a sense of morality that creates resentment. This is Baudrillard 94. The more the human race reconciles itself with nature, the less it is reconciled with itself. There's a violence of the species against itself. It treats itself as a residue of the species, and is commencing its own disappearance by resentment towards itself, a deliberate inclination which leads to manage that disappearance as a destiny. The effects produced by the infinite nature of the earth for the first time contrasting with the infinity of our development is such that our species is switching to a collective suicide, whether by nuclear violence or biological virulence. We are subjecting ourselves to the same experimental pressures. The species in our laboratories manage programming its own destruction with the same ferocity as the destruction of others. The experimental phase sweeps away all these self-preservation instincts. This signals the benefit of a frenzy for ecological conservation, which is really more to do with remorse. A wholly different tendency is already one of the sacrificing the species to experimentation. We have a reverse effect running counter to any scientific vision of the species. The idea that natural selection leads to a species capable of morally transcending natural selection. The species is aiming for technical immortality. The human species is losing its own immunity, specifically becoming immortalized. The inhuman species is abolishing in itself the morality of living in favor of the immortality of the dead, immortalizing itself as a zero-degree of a living species, an operational artifact which no longer even obeys the law of species except the law of artificial species, whose morality is even more rapid, marked and rapid. Next argument, the Clark evidence is an impact argument to this. There is broad, the structures of climate change cannot be resolved within the modernist conception of agency that the AF relies upon. Their notions that activism and political progress are something that reify these structures, which means that they will make it impossible to solve climate change. Even if the AF is not about climate change is something that is an existential threat to environmental degradation that they cannot possibly resolve. The next argument they make is this Newman evidence. The Newman evidence goes negative. Newman is talking about a stance outside the state, which our Young evidence describes as the stance of the activist. You are, in fact, the deliberative Democrat. This evidence goes negative. Additionally, there's an ethics DA to their argument. Externalizing your ethics on institutions is the worst form of violence because it exonerates individuals of responsibility. Rosso 4. Law has to present itself as indispensable for any kind of conflict to be solved. The consequences paradoxical. The more inescapable the rule of law is, the less responsible the individual becomes. The responsibility of the person towards others delegated on the law, legal institution, exonerate me from my central responsibility towards the other, breaking the moral proximity that makes every ethics possible. The other becomes faceless, making it all too easy when you or demands justice and even exert violence. The logic of evil becomes not a means but an end in itself. The possibility of the worst takes the form of my responsibility towards the other being delegated on the institutions of law. They inevitably arguments about legal structures are incorrect. The system is seen as only natural because of the influence of structural legal change imposes. Bergman said of 8. How can law appear fair, objective, and neutral, and perpetuate the power of the powerful psychological dynamics? Law's use of abstractions move legal issues and concepts remote from actual power. Law itself helps to constitute people's consciousness and trusting notions like the divide between public and private marketing governance so deeply as it seems natural beyond change. Law itself supplies the methods and rationales that society uses to treat racial, class, and gender inequalities as inevitable. Law cannot be a tool of progressive change, and that demobilizes social change, that turns the affirmative. Berkman Center in 8. Rights discourse contributes to passivity, alienation, and sense inevitably even when relatively powerless to win. Rights impede social change. Victory may make those complacent while galvanizing their opponents to duel all they can. Conflicting rights are always available. Conservatives can deploy indeterminacy for their benefit. Rights reinforces the individualistic ideology and claims absolute power within individuals that must be undermined if progressive changes become those, and power grants strategic concessions that co-opt genuinely radical social movements. Progressive rights support ideology they must oppose, and their exclusion, their model of democracy relies on structural exclusion. Tinkering with your arguments does not remedy that exclusion. This turns all of your activism arguments. Young and 1. The activist is all affected the opportunity to express the opinions and deliberative process of society structured by deep social and economic inequalities. The formally inclusive deliberative processes enact structural biases in which the powerful and socially advantaged activists have granted access to deliberative process and therefore are able to dominate the proceedings. Such differential access to care about justice should continue to criticize processes of public deliberation from the outside to the extent that structural inequalities in society operate effectively to restrict access to deliberative process or deliberations. Conclusions are not legitimate. Protesting the process and demonstrating against the underlying relations of privilege and disadvantage and condition them. If we participate in these formally inclusive processes, we confer undeserved legitimacy on them. Yeah, that's good.
We have 9:55.
Here's one shortcut I'd like you to read.
Okay, and I'm going to save.
Okay, cool. These are the cards that I was gonna read. Finish that card. Read that card with that tag.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
I really do.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. The order is the case and then framework. I'm gonna move the table a little more closer to here.
Okay, yeah, definitely.
Is everybody good?
One moment. Yep.
Great. NEPA exceptions cause community powerlessness to government and corporate invasion. The root cause of structural oppression. Only the F is sufficient to resolve this. Solvency is conceded. They have also not answered our fundamental framework argument that you should view the F in terms of what it actually does, which means that we are sufficient to solve now independently. These NEPA exceptions cause people to die, have massive asthma, cancer risk, and waste dumping, etc. Causes a low quality of life and massive death. Now they make this argument that we don't solve it because we don't solve corporate bombardment. Our whole point is the inequality of the law. NEPA is uniquely able to challenge it because it leads to measures that are within the line of the letter of the law, but not in the spirit. A is monkey wrenching. We throw sand in the gears. You can file thousands of complaints by communities, which are very easy to do, but the government has to respond to each and every one, which makes them unable to build and develop in these neighborhoods. B is that it creates a nexus for community organizing. It brings people together, increases awareness of injustices, which spills over to broader forms of challenging inequality. C is that it forms the foundation for change more broadly. It produces challenges or channels for action. It's also a prerequisite for any revolutionary action, which is the right card. We are the only ones reading evidence about actually NEPA and what it has caused in positive sense. They conceded the Bras card. Only NEPA was able to stop California from building more prisons because they were deemed to be a public health risk, which is a material how we solve. They say that we are trying to fix nature. The app is obviously not that. We just stop development. Nature does what it wants, but the corporate dumpers are not able to. The climate argument is not offense. There's not a reason not to allow. There's not a reason to allow dumping to occur. Externalization argument. This links more to their framework because they don't force the consideration of external actors, but our framework solves it, which will be on the next page. NEPA is also uniquely able to solve because it empowers communities to act. Now making demands for legal changes, politicizing more simple and quasi-political trends, militate their existence, a real confrontation with power, therapeutic fast that has self-actualization, ultimately social anti-political terms, outbreaks of anger that lack political direction and orientation, defined by a spirit of withdrawal and pessimism, shape wholesale retreat from public sphere, common arena in which citizens openly discuss problems and develop solutions. Only here the citizens can confront the world's problems. Anti-political character renders them more important than critical. They say that the law isn't inevitable. This is about how the law isn't inevitable because we only think it is. No shit. Yes, the law does not exist as an external reality, but instead as a collective projection. But that does not mean you can wish it away. The alternative is not able to get rid of this assumption, which is also backed up by instantiation of force in the form of the police, the military, etc. The second card is about how it's about rights discourse generally, not about NEPA, so it doesn't apply to the K. Pragmatic knowledge leads to future material change. You should frame this through the inevitability of the law. There is no alternative, which means you cannot vote negative. Any benefit to the app overwhelms the minor contribution to a deeply flawed status quo. Coherence is necessary to apply what we learn later. They are a fun FYI from talking around with your frat brothers, but do not change anything that is larger now. Prioritizing effects of policy options best harnesses debate's ability to change the world. Imagining courses of action teaches consider implementation, reactions, cost, jurisdiction, other concerns we cannot learn about under a framework of theory disconnected from actions. Lama and Napoli says these skills allow us to influence larger policy through scholarship and activism, which is empirically true for environmental justice, where activists, academics, and community residents have achieved massive victory. That is Bullard. It means A, we get to weigh the F, and B, there is no old solvency. They have conceded that institutions are inevitable and dictate the conditions of the world. The ult's inability to engage them dooms it to failure. The institutional configurations exist independently of micropolitics, so the conceded Jones and Spicer argument. Now, there's an accountability disset to their framework. Their condemnation of action means we are never forced to take action to improve the lives of people who are not us, which is the worst form of not in my backyard logic that prevents larger change against waste. We need to orient our practice around people that are not us. Now, when they explain the implication of the canal analogy, we will answer it. We are not magical saying that you vote and everybody becomes a scholar activist, which is a discrete category. Instead, debate is an iterative process, and over time, scholar activist is an idea that is independent of either team. It's not a stable identity, but instead a goal and a heuristic for our practice, people who can change stuff, which is above. It's also not just superficial, it leads to a larger change. The app is a different form of study within the labyrinth while keeping the end goal in sight of environmental justice. Where their framework is infinite regress, does not change anything because we are never able to finish studying. Their cave knowledge production is way too vague in terms of waste. Epistemic communities have diffused information, and this is a material impact on the global agenda. I will finish the one I see Lloyd card Lloyd innate with intensification, world regulations, the league of distant localities, even localized policy, increasingly about global concern, try task museum to deal with these and facilitate diffusion knowledge from local to global, which influence policy making, policy change. The international arena is primarily bottom-up process. He chooses these transfer of high status waste formerly overlooked. They shift from the local to the global agenda with help of epistemic communities. Control over knowledge and information is an important dimension of power that can lead to new patterns of behavior. Independently challenging rhetorical silence of white supremacy is a valuable pedagogical act. Crenshaw 97. Ideology, white privilege operates through rhetorical silence. Rhetorical silence sustains an ideology. White privilege, colossal unseen dimensions of silence are key political tools for preventing white privilege and maintaining meritocracy. He thinks of silence as absence of speech. Silence as active may be interpreted. The absence of speech signifies that can exist in discursive silence is whiteness. Silence signifies the whitest natural condition assumed for norm. The silence symbolizes the nature of things. Silence symbolizes the hierarchical nature as surely as does speech. Market speech. Now they make a paradox argument. This is above definitions are totally meaningless. The point is the communities define what justice is, which means that they are the retreat to linguistics. How do we define justice? Who the fuck cares? The important thing is that we stop dumping. Now they say the law is bad. First, it's inevitable. Second is that we decrease its legitimacy through monkey wrenching and also through calling on it to change, which was the Newman card. Third is that we are a path to change and reform is the basis for revolution. That was the Ray card. Now even if they do not have an central advocacy, you can still essentially vote for the permutation because our methodology and strategy is commensurate with the methodology and strategy of study. You can challenge NEPA and also study their zero link articulated. You can prefer not to engage in every other sphere of the law that has ever existed, but you ought to prefer to engage in NEPA because it is beneficial, as proven by this overwhelming specificity of debating. I'll finish the Crenshaw card unless you want me to say something else.
Talk about study just causes the right to fill in. That was the Beaujord indict that we read that they.
Yes. Study alone causes the right to fill in, causes corporate control, and causes all these forms of dumping. They will keep doing it no matter what, which means if there is a 1% risk the app does something beneficial, you ought to vote for us. You should not vote app on neg on presumption because we proposed a change they have conceded is good. Can I finish the Crenshaw card? Very structured privilege generates silence, the most powerful rhetoric for maintaining existing disputes of privilege to be silenced out of rhetorical restrictions help protect material privilege because they mask its existence.
Before we start prep, can I upload you my computer?
Fine, man.
Sure.
5:42.
not ready.
The affirmative only opens avenues for communities to engage. This does not resolve the inequality within the legal structure. Vulnerable communities still don't have the funds for New York lawyers. They still don't have the time for a decade-long legal battle with the federal government, and they don't have the energy to dump into the black hole of bad faith. You whitewash the reality of the law for people of color. We should adopt the ethos of the activists, specifically in the context of environmental destruction. Being activists is better than being deliberative Democrats. Being a deliberative Democrats because being deliberative Democrats, activists refuse to engage and participate in structures that produce inequality and instead organize to disrupt those structures from the outside. The apps are deliberative Democrats because they believe in piecemeal legal change through the engagement with the system that naturalizes inequality and is structurally produced by the system. The app is a Trojan horse for communities of color, a gift that is a trap since they cannot actualize the change the app wants to achieve because of inequality in the legal system. That results in people investing energy that could be spent mobilizing for other protests. You do not resolve nuclear dumping on native lands, which means you should be skeptical of any internal link chain that they're claiming to solve for, because their impact evidence is all about nuclear dumping, not about NEPA being applied abroad and in military instances. The May question does not flow affirmative because they don't access May because it assumes that the nature is a harmonious machine. Nature and your attempt to fix it only engenders a ressentement which attempts to fail and blows back in your face. That's the Bochard evidence. The structures of eco-death will not change underneath a modern conception of subjectivity. That's our Clark evidence. Newman evidence goes negative because it describes the stance of the activist rather than deliberative Democrat. Now, the ethics disadvantage. This is my Rosso evidence. Externalizing your responsibility onto institutions ethically insulates yourselves and demands violence because you delegate morality and ethical relationships to the state. That severs individual responsibility since our relationships with others are mediated through the structures of the state. The second impact is the legitimization of structural violence committed by the state, since the state becomes the ultimate arbiter of ethics. The law's problem is structural. It's not because we haven't tried hard enough. The structure of legal change is normalized by the 1AC's orientation towards it. That's our Young evidence. Yeah, that's the answer to the Morse evidence framework. There is no such thing as a pragmatic legal knowledge in the 1AC's interpretation of what the law actually is. Sovereignty is a paradox, an Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail that only gains legitimacy when we choose to grant it. This feeling of unsatisfaction that I'm trying to convey about the way the law is and the paradoxical relationship that us as subjects have with the sovereign is what I'm trying to communicate about voting negative. The feeling of unsatisfaction means of what the law means to us is the fundamental problem in the 1AC's theorization. They are an ins first analysis that looks at how awesome the world would be if NEPA was enforced differently, but they don't trace their analysis back to this space. FYI, saying cost-benefit analysis and you don't have an alt is not a revolutionary activist claims. They're just merely rephrasing old debate arguments in order to deactivate my claims based on the form of my claims rather than the content. That's why this is a framework argument. Lewis's notion of study should be read side by side with Young's notion of the activist. It is more important to know the limits of debate and what it can give us than it is to have a naive faith in the law. We aren't saying that we have all the answers. We didn't invent the rain, but we do have the best umbrella, because once the glamour of the scholar activist has worn off and we wake up on Monday morning after the party, we will be left not with the results of our positive action, but only we'll have lost part of ourselves to the void of apathy that their investment in the law relies on. Now, they say that institutions are inevitable. Look, I can lose this claim. I'm planning on losing this claim and still winning this debate because, yes, institutions are inevitable, but the way institutions gain their power is through it being enforced without significance. This means that our engagement with sovereignty is necessarily paradoxical, and that the only way that we can break out of the chain of identity categories self-legitimating their own forms of knowledge production is to somehow be unsatisfied with that, to prefer not to engage in whatever they're calling the quote-unquote scholar activists, because it makes politics a little too easy in order for us to be able to wholeheartedly sign off on it. Now, the next argument is this action disadvantage that we need to orient people around, not to us. You're not orienting to the people in this space. You are orienting to some imaginary people in Los Angeles. You're not even talking about the people in Okinawa that your 1AC is about. The people in this space have no propensity to go outside and change the way NEPA is enforced, but we do have a propensity to change our own conception of what the law means and our own conception of how sovereignty enacts itself on us. Now, the next argument is that debate is an iterative process and that the scholar activist is just a heuristic. The new fad in debate is just to say whatever your link to the K is just a heuristic. One, you haven't explained what a heuristic is. Two, that heuristic still results in negative understandings of static identity within academia, which is bad. Additionally, even if debate is necessarily iterative, that's not an argument for why their engagement with the law vis-a-vis the way that they accept the law's normalizing processes is necessarily bad. Preferring not to is still an answer to this idea of debate as an iterative process because it denies the logic of the deliberative democracy inherent in this argument. Additionally, Young evidence turns this argument because it says that this idea that the law will just incrementally get better is what has trapped people of color within legal structures because the structure itself is unequal, but we can change tiny little facets of the structure. That will never resolve the broad inequality, which is a negative on presumption argument. They say this Lloyd 8 local global argument, don't let them extrapolate this into some brand new 2AR shit. It still applies to the way that we're debating the dichotomy between Young's deliberative Democrat and Young's activist. Now, they say that challenging rhetorical science of white supremacy is necessarily good. I don't understand what the link to this argument is about. We're not being silent about white supremacy by challenging your claim to do something about the law. We are taking on the question of white supremacy more seriously because we are saying that it's not merely a linguistic project that we can just flip back if we wanted to. Drop down to the permutation argument. They say that our methods are commensurate. There is no methodology in this debate. There is the 1AC's bad faith, the way they assumed how the law worked and how easy it is to engage with the law. We are saying that that assumption dooms your politics and is something that you should not easily endorse.
I believe we have 7:44.
Yep, that's what I got you at.
stand at your service.
You're good, Michael.
The precedent set abroad in Okinawa will come home to roost. The perception that the executive can use public interest to circumvent NEPA review means activists are no longer able to effectively hold agencies' feet to the fire, and NEPA review is undermined writ large. You've conceded that there is a war on communities of color in the status quo. The alternative does nothing to resolve it. They leave toxic waste sitting in black communities. They leave nuclear radiation sitting on native reservations, and globally they allow for corporations to keep dumping nuclear waste abroad, causing 1 in 200 people to die of premature death as a result of cancer and other health fatalities as a consequence. Weigh the immediacy and urgency of these material impacts is higher than the probabilistic and speculative, vague, unexplained 2NR impact calculus. Now, NEPA is a weapon in the fight against environmental and white supremacy and environmental justice. A ScWy institution filter all their arguments through empirics. The board evidence that NEPA has been successful in East Los Angeles, Harlem, etc., and was able to mobilize communities because it brought communities together, got people talking to each other, and was able to build broad coalescing movements that were able to tackle broader structures. Our evidence assumes their indicts of the Civil Rights Act and says the problem with that was it did not empower communities, but NEPA directly challenges that because it brings communities into decision making. B subpoint is monkey wrenching, entirely conceded. We are not pro-law. We allow for NEPA to be used as a way of stopping the government from building things and allow for activists to throw sand into the gears of the legal machinery and have infinite review requirements. This doesn't require you to have a New York lawyer. The only requirement is that communities demand that corporations have EISs and can do it multiple times. That puts all the costs are shouldered by the corporation and creates an economic incentive for them to back down and get out of communities. Now, activists are being shut down in the status quo, which means that even if you adopt the ethos an activist, legal structures operate on them, like the public interest exception, but only using law is able to challenge that. They have no explanation of what specific projects the app would trade off with other than other objectives, so hold a high threshold for reading their evidence. So remember that all their law fails our evidence is super generic and totalizing. We have specific reasons why NEPA was able to block a prison expansion in California and contributed to a broader goal of prison abolition based upon this. So for the specificity and empirical nature of the app claims, the Newman evidence doesn't float egg. This was unexplained. And the 2NR, the call for the state to change, highlights that it is a failure in the status quo and is not living up to white ideals. That is a challenge to its very legitimacy. It means that our act of calling upon the state, which is external to our position in this round, is net beneficial for the goals of extra legal activism writ large. We don't externalize because we use responsibility. As scholar activists, we recognize that the law is something out there, but we also know that we can do things here to influence that broader structure. That all of our scholar activist arguments on how divisions they process amplifies that they have conceded that they are worse. The kind of abdication is studying for study's sake, which is the only explanation of the alternative. The environment case was unexplained. The 2NR doesn't have an impact and has no link because we don't create an ideal version of nature. Rather, we are just saying people should not be targeted based on the color of their skin and used as a dumping site for nuclear waste and other forms of toxicity. Decay. We obviously do not control the law now. Thank you, Captain Obvious. However, our framework prioritizes the evaluation of policy consequences as a training ground, which allows for us to influence legal structures down the road. There are a couple of reasons. The focus on jurisdiction, cost, legalese, etc. trains us as debaters with attention to particularities. Instead of making sweeping claims like law is always bad, we can recognize how there are technical complications of the NEPA EIS requirement that may circumvent some of those broader problems. That is a nuanced analysis that only our framework can come to grips with. It creates students who are able to use those nuanced analysis as influence, as means of influencing policy community. You have conceded the autonomy and the Napoli evidence, which is fantastic. It's just there is a window of opportunity, and policymakers are increasingly receptive to research collaborations with activists, which means we do not have to mean that we have a debate creates policymakers, or rather it creates an informed citizenry that is capable of influencing them in the status quo. It's not the Kafka argument. You have conceded there is a tangible impact to scholarship. The Bullard evidence is the only NEPA-specific evidence being read on framework. This is the laser-like focus of activists and scholar activists through research contribution was able to lead to environmental justice victories in the past, like in a parliament in Los Angeles. But there is an external dissent to their framework that they have no game on. They replicate NIMBY logic. When Rob says that you didn't talk about anyone in this room in the 2NR, that's an example of how their politics always folds back upon itself. It is more important to talk about our studying, our academic position, our immediate vicinity, but you cannot constrain your moral horizons to people that you can see in front of you. You should demand the debate do better and train us to deal with the broader structures of oppression less. We create a politics that only emphasizes purity within localized immediate spaces while allowing the rest of the world to burn. That is washing our hands of responsibility, net more depoliticizing. Even if you have doubts about the law, you've conceded. The more stuff just makes an anti-politics argument that you have dropped, that a rejection of legal analysis only causes the right to gain more influence within the law and takes all negative aspects of the law comparatively worse. Our framework is a bulwark. Even if you do believe that there are flaws with our framework, you should recognize that studying is as an infinite academic jerk-off that doesn't do anything for people who are in desperate need of action. It doesn't change the world. I thought cross-sex of the 2NC was devastating on that question. It also is a contradiction with their ethos of the activist argument entirely conceded, because the activist demands that you go out and do stuff, but Rob just wants to sit around in his apartment all day reading books and does not want to change the world, which proves they are more depoliticizing now. What does unsatisfaction do? Congress has a single-digit approval rating. People have expressed unsatisfaction, but they have not been able to change the reasons why they are unsatisfied. They have no alt, and they have agreed the status quo is bad, which means even if the AF might not be the best, there is zero chance that they change the war on people of color that is occurring in the status quo. They don't get rid of nuclear waste. We can create activists who know what needs to be done.
Good debate, y'all. Good debate.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Good debate.
right? I think there are some things I just don't understand about the and I think that it's not, okay, let me start with this way. I think you go for two links. I think the first link is a question of whether or not the affirmative is a form of deliberative, democracy. And I think that if you win, that there is a difference, well, I think you're winning there's a difference between activism and deliberative democracy. I don't think you're winning the AF as deliberative democracy for a few reasons. The first one is, I think your Young evidence identifies deliberative democracy as an attempt to maintain kind of state sovereignty. And I think there are just entire portions of the AF that I don't think you respond to. The first one is that the affirmative is not an attempt to kind of redeem or redress the state, but an attempt to disrupt its ability to scapegoat the uniqueness question of activism existing in communities now, which I think troubles a lot of your arguments later on, but I'll get to that, right? But so if they win that activism is happening in communities now, and they disrupt the only way that institutions or corporations can stop activism from being effective at kind of silencing those activists that exist in the status quo, then I think that troubles your ability to articulate the AF as a form of deliberative democracy. I think they're probably closer to what your Young would say an activist is than studying is, simply because I don't think studying is explained in a way that, for me, is coherent to disruption. Even if studying exists kind of as an attempt to obfuscate production in the academic realm, I don't know how that's applied in this round in a way that gets me to that means that is a form, because I think Young is literally talking about protest or a refusal to engage, right? But that refusal to engage, in my mind, would be more, I think your best link would be a refusal to talk about the topic, right? The link to the AF with this type of argument would be when they focus on the topic, that's their attempt to maintain kind of the structure of sovereignty that is the United States. Because there's no, I think your best arguments are there's no reason why they have to tie a discussion of NEPA to Okinawa. You can just say we should stop dumping stuff on communities of color, period. And we can use law to break it down. None of their examples are based off of, well, I guess all of their loophole stuff would be a reason why they have to talk about, or extraterritorial dumping would be a reason they have to talk about Okinawa. But I think your tie to the resolution is probably the best link you can get, and I don't think that's a link you have in this debate. I think the second argument you have is this ethics disad that I have to evaluate. So Rosa, again, I'm troubled with this link too, because I think that assumes you're winning, that the AF is an attempt to redeem the legal system, and I don't think they're that. Does that make sense? So I mean, I think if those two things are true, I don't know why you access your ethos of activism argument, and I don't know why studying does that either. And if neither one of those can access an ethos of activism, then I have a very low threshold to vote AF at that point, given that all that exists, right, are the already inevitability of communities being crushed by corporations that want to dump waste on their property, or in their region, I guess I'll say, not their property, whatever. Yeah, and I don't know how to resolve any of those questions in your favor, so I vote AF. I don't think you win a permutation, because I don't know what the alternative is. Also don't think you explain a permutation at all. I think you might also want to change the term of art you use for disruption. You probably shouldn't say monkey wrench when you're talking about people of color. It just seems like that could be a link argument that someone could make against you that's problematic. I'm pretty sure there are several different ways that you can make the same argument without tying it to monkeys. Just a thought. I don't think it matters in this debate, but just a free FYI. You might want to
Definitely, we'll change that going forward.
I also read the Clark Rosantomont continual running stuff. I feel like this is I feel like your framework argument is a criticism of kind of more of a reformist, we pull out troops to stop terrorism and that makes the US look good, more so than an AF that starts from a position that says that in the status quo, communities are attempting to rally against environmental injustice. The only way that they can actually do anything is if we take out the loophole that allows corporations to continue to dump in their regions, right? So I think they have a very particular AF, and I think your criticism is of a much more traditional form of an AF than what they read. And that's just my suggestion about how I think you probably should re-articulate, or get the link off the plan text, like I said. And I think if you have a link off the plan text, it makes it easier to vote negative given kind of the way things shook out. Have to vote add. You guys anyone have any questions?
I have one if that's okay.
Okay.
What did you think of card selection for the 1AR?
What do you mean?
Like,
You
should I have read the cards that I read? Should I have read fewer cards?
I think you all should have read through a lot more of the evidence and just done some comparative analysis. I think if you just went to the young cards, which I think is the strongest links that they're going for, and say all of their links are predicated off of them winning that we are a form of deliberative democracy. This is what their evidence says deliberative democracy is, and this is why we are not that, and why we are actually activists. You win the debate a lot easier. I don't actually have to read any cards, right? Just card dumping more in a debate like this doesn't make a huge amount of sense, right? Clean it up, stick with the, keep extending the uniqueness claims you're making, keep talking about how it's key for us to solve NEPA and are to close loopholes in NEPA and the status quo, and you're in a lot better place earlier on, right?
Definitely. I have a couple questions about cross-sects of the 2NC. I kind of felt like I was just asking the same question in different words, just because I expected a bit more pushback on, like, does the alt actually do stuff? Do you think there are, like, better ways of asking that question than, like, does the alt do things?
No, you should, I don't know, felt like it was fine. What do you do is probably fine enough, and if they don't say anything, you can move on. I don't think you have to harp on it continuously.
Yeah.
It seems like they're pretty willing to concede they don't think anything happens or anything should happen, just it's a question of orientation. So, I think you all make the right choice to spend quite a bit of time talking about how debate is a training ground to counteract a lot of the orientation stuff, although I don't think the orientation stuff comes into play if they're not winning framing on the app, so.
In terms of app explanation of framework,
Uh-huh.
what do you think are there any better ways that you would advise explaining kind of like the debate can have productive value outside of just like policy research collaboration?
Well, I think maybe if the story is tied a little more to the historical examples you have of how NEPA is used, or how law has been used in the past to kind of fight back against corporations that want to do things. Actually, the example you have is a prison being built, right? So if you use those historical examples, I think you need to tie them to how a lot of that is not just based in understanding of the law itself, but also an understanding of how to research to find strategies to build up against kind of larger institutional injustices. And I thought the explanation of a training ground, like I said I think it happened in 2AR and it was very little bit in the 1AR, but I think a lot more of that needs to come when they're trying to contest your ability to export, right, the strategy of affirmative into the real world. But I mean, I thought the explanation was fine, I guess. I mean, it wasn't lacking.
Or like things about tying the